The USS Franklin, nicknamed Big Ben, was one of 24 Essex-class aircraft carriers built during World War II for the United States Navy, and the fifth U.S. Navy ship to bear the name. Commissioned in January 1944, she served in several campaigns in the Pacific War, earning 4 battle stars. She was badly damaged by a Japanese air attack in March 1945, with the loss of over 800 of her crew, becoming the most heavily damaged United States carrier to survive the war. Movie footage of the actual attack was included in the 1949 film Task Force starring Gary Cooper. After the attack, she returned to the U.S. mainland for repairs. Missing the rest of the war, she was decommissioned in 1947. While in reserve, she was reclassified as an attack carrier, then an anti-submarine carrier, and finally an aircraft transport, but was never modernized and never saw active service again. Franklin and Bunker Hill were the only Essex-class carriers not to see active service as aircraft carriers after World War II. The Franklin was sold for scrap in 1966. Construction and commissioning. The keel of Franklin was laid down on the 7th of December 1942, the first anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and she was launched by the Newport News Shipbuilding Company in Virginia on the 14th of October 1943, sponsored by Lieutenant Commander Mildred H. McAfee, an American naval officer who was the director of the Waves. This warship was named in honor of the founding father Benjamin Franklin and for the previous warships that had been named for him. It was not named for the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, that was fought during the American Civil War, as is sometimes erroneously reported, although a footnote in the Franklin Comes Home does attribute the naming to the Battle of Franklin. Franklin was commissioned on the 31st of January 1944, with Captain James M. Shoemaker in command. Among the plankers was a ship's band made up of several enlisted men who were professional musicians at the time, including Saxy Doerl and Dean Kincaid, assigned to Franklin by a lottery. Service history. World War II. Franklin steamed south to Trinidad for a shakedown, and soon thereafter, she departed in Task Group 27.7 for San Diego, to engage in intensive training exercises preliminary to combat duty. In June, she steamed via Pearl Harbor for Eniwetok Island, where she joined TG 58.2. the Bonin and Mariana Islands. On the last day of June 1944, she sortied for carrier strikes on the Bonin Islands in support of the subsequent Mariana Islands assault. Her planes destroyed aircraft on the ground and in the air, gun installations, airfield and enemy shipping. On the 4th of July, strikes were launched against Iwo Jima, Chichijima, and Hahajima, hitting ground targets, sinking a large cargo vessel in the harbor and setting 3 smaller ships on fire. On the 6th of July, Franklin began strikes on Guam and Rota Island to soften them up for the invasion forces that were going to land on Guam, and those strikes continued until the 21st of July, when she lent direct support to enable safe landing of the first assault waves. 2 days of replenishment at Saipan permitted her to steam in Task Force 58 for photographic reconnaissance and air strikes against the islands of the Palau Islands Group. On 25 and the 26th of July, her planes struck enemy planes, ships, and ground installations. The Franklin departed on the 28th of July and headed for Saipan, and the following day she was shifted to TG 58.1. Although high seas prevented taking on a needed load of bombs and rockets, Franklin steamed for another raid against the Bonins. On the 4th of August, her fighters attacked Chichijima and her dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked a ship convoy north of Ototojima. Targets included radio stations, a seaplane base, airstrips, and ships. A period of upkeep and recreation from 9 to 28 August ensued at Eniwetok before she departed with Enterprise. Belo Wooden San Jacinto for neutralization and diversionary attacks against the Bonnans. From the 31st of August to the 2nd of September, strikes from Franklin inflicted ground damage, sank 2 cargo ships, destroyed enemy planes in flight, and undertook photographic surveys. Pelilia. On the 4th of September, Franklin took on supplies at Saipan, and then she steamed in TG-38.1 for an attack against Yap Island, which included direct air coverage of the Pelilia invasion on the 15th. The task group took on supplies at Manus Island from 21 to the 25th of September. Franklin, now the flagship of TG-38.4, returned to the Palau area where she launched daily patrols and night fighters. On the 9th of October, she rendezvoused with carrier groups cooperating in airstrikes in support of the coming occupation of Leyte Island. At twilight on the 13th, the task group came under attack by 4 bombers, and Franklin twice was narrowly missed by torpedoes. An enemy plane, a harbinger of the coming kamikaze campaign, crashed on Franklin's deck abaft the aircraft carrier's island, sliding across the deck and into the water on her starboard beam. Leyte. Early on September 14th, a fighter sweep was made against Apari, Luzon, following which she steamed to the east of Luzon to neutralize installations to the east prior to invasion landings on Leyte. On the 15th, Franklin was attacked by 3 enemy planes, one of which scored with a bomb that hit the after outboard corner of the deck edge elevator, killing 3 men and wounding 22. The carrier's aircraft hit Manila Bay on the 19th of October when her planes sank and damaged ships and boats, destroyed a floating dry dock, and claimed 11 Japanese aircraft. During the initial landings on Leyte, Franklin's aircraft attacked surrounding airstrips and launched search patrols in anticipation of the approach of a reported enemy attack force. On the morning of the 24th of October, in the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, her planes formed part of the waves that attacked the Japanese 1st Raiding Force, in so doing helping to sink Musashi south of Luzon, damage Fuso and Yamashiro, and sink Wakaba. As further enemy threats seemed to materialize in another quarter, Franklin, with TGs 38.4, 38.3, and 38.2 sped to intercept the advancing Japanese carrier force and attack at dawn. The distant carrier force was actually a sacrificial feint, as by the time the Japanese were almost out of serviceable airplanes and, even more importantly, very short on trained pilots, but the admiral in charge, William Halsey, took the bait and steamed furiously off after them without communicating his intentions clearly, leading to the infamous "The World Wonders" communications debacle. Franklin's strike groups combined with those from the other carriers on the 25th of October in the battle off Cape Engano to damage Chiyoda and sink Zuiho. Retiring in her task group to refuel, she returned to the Leyte action on the 27th of October, her planes concentrating on a heavy cruiser and 2 destroyers south of Mindoro. She was underway about 100 miles off Sama on the 30th of October when enemy bombers appeared bent on a suicide mission. 3 doggedly pursued Franklin, the first plummeting off her starboard side, the second hitting the flight deck second crashing through to the galley deck, killing 56 men and wounding 60, the third discharging another near miss by Franklin, before diving into the flight deck of Bellewood. Both carriers retired to Ulithi Atoll for temporary repairs, and then Franklin proceeded to the Puget Sound Navy Yard, arriving on the 28th of November 1944 for repairs of her battle damage. In the meantime, on the 7th of November, Captain Shoemaker was relieved by Captain Leslie E. Gerres as the carrier's commanding officer. Captain Gerres was a strict disciplinarian whose autocracy was disliked by many of Franklin's crew. Franklin departed from Bremerton on the 2nd of February 1945, and after training exercises and pilot qualification operations, she joined the TG-58.2 for strikes on the Japanese homeland in support of the Okinawa landings. On the 15th of March, she rendezvoused with TF-58 units, and 3 days later launched sweeps and strikes against Kagoshima and Izumi on southern Kyushu. The 19th of March 1945, before dawn on the 19th of March 1945, Franklin, which had maneuvered to within 50 miles of the Japanese mainland, closer than any other U.S. carrier during the war, launched a fighter sweep against Honshu and later a strike against shipping in Kobe Harbor. The Franklin crew aboard had been called to battle stations 12 times within 6 hours that night, and Gerres downgraded the alert status to condition 3, allowing his men freedom to eat or sleep, although gunnery crews remained at the stations. Suddenly, a single aircraft, possibly a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, though other accounts suggest an Aichi D-3 Val, also a dive bomber, pierced the cloud cover and made a low-level run on the ship to drop 2 semi-armor-piercing bombs. The damage analysis came to the conclusion that the bombs were 550 pounds, though neither the Val nor Judy had the attachment points to carry 2 such weapons, nor did the Japanese single-engine torpedo bombers in horizontal bomber mode. However, the Aichi B-7 Air Grace had this capability. One bomb struck the flight deck centerline, penetrating to the hangar deck, affecting destruction and igniting fires through the second and third decks, and knocking out a combat information center and airplot. The second hit aft, tearing through 2 decks. At the time she was struck, Franklin had 31 armed and fueled aircraft warming up on her flight deck. The hangar deck contained 22 additional planes, of which 16 were fueled and 5 were armed. The forward gasoline system had been secured, but the aft system was operating. The explosion on the hangar deck ignited the fuel tanks on the aircraft, and gasoline vapor explosion devastated the deck. Only 2 crewmen survived the fire on the hangar deck. The explosion also jumbled aircraft together on the flight deck above, causing further fires and explosions, including the detonation of 12 tiny TIM air-to-surface rockets. Franklin lay dead in the water, lost all radio communications, and broiled under the heat from enveloping fires. On the bridge, Captain Gerres ordered Franklin's magazines flooded, but this could not be carried out as the ship's water mains were destroyed by the explosions or fire. Admiral Ralph Davison transferred his flag to the destroyer Usmilla by Breeches Buoy and suggested to abandon ship, but Gerres refused to scuttle the Franklin as there were still many men alive below deck. Many of the crew were blown overboard, driven off by fire, killed or wounded, but the hundreds of officers and enlisted who voluntarily remained saved the ship. Among the dead was one of the ship's surgeons, LCDR George W. Fox, MD, who was killed while tending to wounded sailors. He was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously. When totaling casualty figures for both Franklin cruisers, numbers increased to 924 killed in action, the worst for any surviving U. warship and second only to that of battleship USS Arizona. Certainly, the casualty figures would have far exceeded this number, but for the work of many survivors. Among these were the Medal of Honor recipients Lieutenant Commander Joseph D. O'Callaghan, the warship's Catholic chaplain, who administered the last rites, organized and directed firefighting and rescue parties, and led men below to wet down magazines that threatened to explode, and also Lieutenant J.G. Donald A. Gary, who discovered 300 men trapped in a blackened mess compartment and, finding an exit, returned repeatedly to lead groups to safety. Gary later organized and led firefighting parties to battle fires on the hangar deck and entered the No. 3 fireroom to raise steam in one boiler. The Santa Fe rescued crewmen from the sea and approached Franklin to take off the numerous wounded and non-essential personnel. Official Navy casualty figures for the 19th of March 1945 fire totaled 724 killed and 265 wounded. Nevertheless, casualty numbers have been updated as new records are discovered. A recent count by Franklin historian and researcher Joseph A. Springer brings total the 19th of March 1945 casualty figures to 807 killed and more than 487 wounded. Franklin had suffered the most severe damage and highest casualties experienced by any U.S. fleet carrier that survived World War II. Franklin, like many other wartime ships, had been modified with additional armament, requiring larger crews and substantial ammunition stocks. Aircraft were both more numerous and heavier than originally planned for, and thus the flight deck had been strengthened. The aircraft carrier, therefore, displaced more than originally planned, her freeboard was reduced, and her stability characteristics had been altered. The enormous quantities of water poured aboard her to fight the fires further reduced freeboard, which was exacerbated by a 13° list on her starboard side, and her stability was seriously impaired such that her survival was in jeopardy. After 6 hours, with the fire finally under control such that the ship could be saved, Admiral Davison deployed 5 destroyers to search for any of Franklin's men which had been blown overboard or jumped into the sea. Return to USA. Franklin was taken in tow by the heavy cruiser Pittsburgh until she was able to raise enough steam to reach a speed of 14 knots, and then she proceeded to the atoll under her own power for emergency repairs. Next she headed to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, for temporary repairs. As per Pearl Harbor procedures, a civilian harbor pilot came aboard to help navigate the carrier to the dock. Captain Garris, however, refused, and said he would take her in himself. He maneuvered the Franklin into the dock area too fast, crashing her into the dock. Embarrassed, Garris blamed the mooring details for the incident. After temporary repairs were completed, the ship continued its journey through the Panama Canal to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, New York, where she arrived on the 28th of April 1945. She had to steam to the east coast of the United States for repairs in New York because all of the repair shipyards on the west coast were heavily overloaded with American warships that had been damaged by Japanese kamikazes. Upon Franklin's arrival in New York, a long brewing controversy over the ship's crew's conduct during her struggles finally came to a head. Captain Garris had accused many of those who had left the ship on the 19th of March 1945 of desertion, despite the fact that those who had jumped into the water to escape had done so to prevent a likely death by fire, or had been led to believe that abandoned ship had been ordered. While en route from the atoll to Hawaii, Garris had proclaimed 704 members of the crew to be members of the Big Ben 704 Club for having stayed with the heavily damaged warship. But investigators in New York discovered that only about 400 were actually on board Franklin continuously. The others had been brought back on board either before and during the stop at Ulithi. All of the charges against the men of her crew were quietly dropped. Captain Guerres retired as a rear admiral, never taking an overseas assignment to command of another U.S. Navy ship again. Repairs. Despite severe damage, Franklin was eventually restored to good condition. The story of this aircraft carrier's near destruction and salvage was chronicled in a wartime documentary, The Saga of the Franklin, and the 2011 documentary, US Franklin, Honor Restored. Post-war. After the war, Franklin was opened to the public for Navy Day celebrations. On the 17th of February 1947, she was decommissioned at Bayonne, New Jersey. While Franklin lay mothballed at Bayonne, she was redesignated as an attack aircraft carrier CV-13 on 1 October 1952, an anti-submarine warfare support carrier CVS-13 on 8 August 1953, and ultimately as an aircraft transport AVT-8 on 15 May 1959. However, she never went to sea again, and was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on 1 October 1964. She and Bunker Hill, which also had sustained severe damage from aerial attack, were the only carriers in their class that never saw any active duty post-war service, though the wartime damage had been successfully repaired. In fact, it was the like-new condition which kept them out of commission, as the Navy for many years envisioned an ultimate reconfiguration for them which never took place. The Navy initially sold Franklin to the Pecan and Metal Company of Portsmouth, Virginia, but reclaimed her due to an urgent Bureau of Ships requirement for her 4 turbo generators. She was again sold for scrap to the Portsmouth Salvage Company of Chesapeake, Virginia on the 27th of July 1966. She departed naval custody under tow on the evening of 1 August 1966. Awards. Franklin received 4 battle stars for her World War II service.